This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 258, replying to an RFP. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're going to learn about how we reply to RFPs and whether we can host a show without Steven.
Stay tuned for the shocking results later.
Joining us as usual, John Picozzi from Oomph Inc. What's new with you this week?
Good afternoon. Yeah, Steven's not here, so that's pretty new. You and I have never done this before without Steven. So, I'm actually in the process of replying to an RFP, so this is kind of a going to be a fresh show for me. And I'm looking forward to talking about it. And I'm also looking forward to hearing Steven's feedback when he comes back next week. What's going on with you?
Not too much. I've been doing a lot of AWS work for a non-Drupal client, learning. Yeah, it's been really interesting learning a lot about all the different services and how they interact with each other. It's a project that like interacts with Salesforce and pulls information in. So, using a lot of different technologies to set up that stack. So it's been pretty fascinating.
What AWS services are you using particularly? Just servers, or are you using a bunch of their other services?
No, there's no servers actually. The project I was working on uses DynamoDB, Lambdas, the Simple Queue service, and I think API Gateway pretty heavily. So basically, it's we're importing external data, so it's kind of like a migration, but we need to queue it up so that it's a very large data set. We need to queue it up so that it goes over a period of time. And, SQS allows you to basically put messages into a queue and then consume them, X number at a time so that you're not overloading your backend systems. We need to move the data into Salesforce, and Salesforce kind of limits you to an API hit every 100 milliseconds or so. Mm-hmm. So we needed to queue things up. So it's been, it was definitely interesting, definitely a learning experience. As I think today's show will be. I mean, each of us has missed a show at some point over the last few years. This is the first time we're having a show without Steven.
But to be fair, he is still lurking. He just sent a Slack message with a story for today's show. And I'm going to share that story now. So apparently, refund checks in the state of Rhode Island are being signed by Mickey Mouse. So there's a picture here of a Rhode Island refund check, and the general treasurer's signature says Mickey Mouse. And I believe the state councilor says Walt Disney, but I could be reading that wrong. Anyway, they are blaming it on a technical error, and that's about as much information as I have, but that's pretty amusing. The hope is that it was actually a technical error and not some sort of hack or anything, because that would be a little bit scary.
Yeah, I mean, being a developer, I'm sure that they just put Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse as their developer side, and they pushed a developer configuration to prod and deployed it. That'd be my guess. And just for our listeners, Steven is in Arizona. I think he mentioned last week his daughter's moving to Arizona, and so he and a couple of them did a road trip.
Where he says it's 115, but it's a dry heat.
I think 115 is 115, whether it's humid or not. But
no, I do not agree. Being in Rhode Island the last week or two with, it feeling like 90 degrees and like the humidity making it feel like 100 to 110, like humidity's gross. I would much rather be in 115 and have it be dry as heck than just be damp all the time.
I'd rather just be in the nice 70s.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I got 3 air conditioners running. My electric bill's, through the roof, but it's nice and cool in here. Anyway, Nick, what is an RFP?
Yeah, so an RFP is a request for proposal. So they're a tool that some companies use to basically put out in the world that they have a project available, and they're looking for people to put some bids in. They have some functionality or some website or some project that needs to be built, and they're just looking for some competing bids.
Yeah, and there are a couple of different like kind of varieties of RFP that you can come across. You know, we've gotten RFPs that have been just that. They've been RFPs. They've come in through the various sources that we get them, and we'll talk about some of those sources in a minute. But there's been a question period. You kind of ship your questions off to an email address, and then you get a document back with a bunch of questions in it. There have been others that have been more of conversational and have been, some people will do kind of pre-work for their RFP and call and say, hey, I'm putting together an RFP. We'd like you guys to reply to it. What do you think we should put in it? So there are a couple of different ways that you can, you can get an RFP, but typically it's a document PDF of some sort with requirements in it for a project.
Yep. Yeah, and there's also sometimes it's legal reasons why RFPs go out. A lot of times businesses do it because they just want to get competing bids, but for municipalities and governments, they're many times for certain value projects they're required to get a minimum number of responses, and so the way that they do that is they'll send out an RFP and compare those responses, and there's certain processes for them selecting the. Yeah,
over the last month or so, we've replied to actually 2 city RFPs, and we'll talk more about that process as this conversation goes on. But it's interesting because you can get an RFP and it can be really good and have a ton of information and answer most of your questions, and then you can get an RFP and it can be really bad and not really answer any of your questions. So we're going to talk more about, the good, the bad, and how you reply to those.
So I think the first question then is, where do you get RFPs? And are there multiple sources, or do you kind of just get them from one place?
Yeah, so I think definitely multiple sources. I can honestly say that I don't actually directly get RFPs, at least right now. Our director of accounts gets a fair amount of RFPs, and our CEO get a fair amount of RFPs. And typically, there are a couple of different channels in which you can get them. As I said previously, we've had instances where companies have reached out and said, hey, we're thinking about we're putting this RFP together. We'd like you guys to reply to it. Here are some more details. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer them in the RFP. In that case, they've directly emailed it to us, or emailed us a link as to where we can find it. There are also, especially if you're doing municipal RFPs, there are websites you can sign up for that the RFP is basically put up on there, and then it's emailed out to everybody. There's also, and I think Mike Miles actually told me about this website. There's no website out there that you can actually go to, and it's basically just an index of like every RFP, like known to man. So the web is predominantly where you get most RFPs from, if it's not like a direct connection that you have.
I think the 2 other places that I get RFPs. So as a freelancer, I don't reply to too many RFPs. I think RFPs are more, agencies it's more their bread and butter, I think. But the 2 places that I'll get RFPs are agencies that are looking for an additional resource to help them with responding to their RFP. So they want to just make sure that, their gut numbers are right. They want to know if I can help them with a particular aspect of it. That's kind of one place. The other place that I'll get RFPs are similar to what you said, directly from the client. Like if a client has they have some legal obligation that requires them to go to RFP, and we're working together already. They'll give me the RFP. Usually I'm helping them build the RFP. So I have a pretty good idea of what's going on, but they have to put the RFP out, and to work on the next project, obviously I have to respond to it and still compete. I think there's a few different strategies when it comes to RFPs. I mean, there's some companies and some people that will respond to every RFP they can. There's some people that won't respond to any at all. There's some that will pick and choose like specific RFPs, depending on the vertical or a particular client, or a particular project that they might be interested in. What's your kind of attitude towards RFPs?
Well, I'll give you my personal attitude towards RFPs, and then I'll broaden it more to the way Oomph kind of approaches RFPs. So personally, I don't love RFPs. I don't feel like they're a great way to assess if a company or a individual is going to be able to provide you with the resources and the product that you need. It is very impersonal. Like, here's a document that I think has all of the stuff. Ask questions. Okay, let me answer your questions. Here's a document that has all the answers to the questions. Okay, you put your bid in. A lot of the times there's a lot of, vagueness in RFPs, and you end up kind of saying like, they might need this or they might need that. So, a lot of times if it's a fixed bid, it's higher than it actually needs to be to get the work done. Just because, there's so much uncertainty. That being said, it's a fact of business. As a company, Oomph replies to numbers of RFPs every year. We have, we prefer, if we can, to, have a conversation with whoever put the RFP out to, be able to ask those questions, but that's not always possible, especially with municipal RFPs. So, I think when you're, trying to determine if an RFP is for you, first things first is to look at the requirements. So I actually have an RFP on my desk right now, and the last page of the RFP has basically the grading criteria that they're going to use to determine if you're a fit. The part of that criteria is, your background, it's your budget or how much it's going to cost. And then other parts are, this happens to be a municipal RFP. So it's, minority / women-owned business. There's a percentage in for that. There's also a percentage based on what town your company is in. Based on those things, those all factor into, whether you should spend time crafting a response to the RFP, because that's ultimately what you're trying to determine. Looking at an RFP, you're trying to figure out like, well, should I put the time into replying to this? What's the likelihood that we're gonna win this, or that an individual is going to be able to get the contract? And that's what it really comes down to. Just kind of reading through it, seeing what they're asking for, because some RFPs, like, they're asking for the world, and they, if they state a budget, the budget's only X number of dollars. You're like, well, there's no way we can do that for that. Just isn't going to make sense.
I think, for me, as a freelancer, there's almost never an RFP that's worth responding to without partnering with somebody. Yep. Because I find that usually RFPs, they're coming from larger companies. They're looking for they're usually for larger projects that are going to require, multiple development resources, project managers, designers. And those are projects that, I'm a really good fit on, but, as a freelancer, I can't handle, fully on my own. So I think, for me, RFPs, usually I'm either working with the company already and helping them build it and responding to it, with some other partner in mind, or I'm partnering with somebody, as I mentioned earlier, to.
And that's really a great approach, because, we actually don't fall into the woman-owned or minority-owned business category. So a lot of times, if that's a requirement of an RFP, we'll team up with, a minority or woman-owned business to do a project. The other aspect there is, we aren't a hosting company, so a lot of times we'll also partner with a hosting vendor to go in together on an RFP. And there's strength in numbers. You gain a lot from being able to do that and being able to work within the community that you've fostered.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things to consider too is that RFP responses typically are an intensive process. I mean, they're not typically like, just not like a one-line response, like, yeah, it's going to be $10,000 or $100,000. One of the bigger RFPs that I've worked on, one of the more interesting ones that I've worked on, was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Massachusetts was converting their state website to Drupal, and
sounds like a small undertaking.
Yeah, it was a big RFP. I mean, and they required, I think, there was under the requirements, they had a list of documents that were required, and there was something like 20 different spreadsheets that were required. They required which developers were going to be associated, what their resumes were, how much time they were going to spend on it, how senior they were. They required you to carry workman's comp and proof of that. They required you to detail every line. Like, they had a spreadsheet that had 250 lines in it saying, like, these are the features that we require. You had to respond to every single one. You had to specify, who the owners were, where you were located. I mean, there was, I think at the end, there were something like 20 or 30 forms that we ended up having to submit in order to respond. As you mentioned, there's a question and answer session usually. I think for that particular project, there was 2 or 3. So, I mean, I think all told, there were 2 or 3 companies that partnered on that particular RFP. And, I think we probably spent close to 40 to 50 hours pulling all the information.
Do you happen to remember when you got the questions document back, how many pages it was? I imagine it was maybe a couple hundred pages.
Yeah, there were. So the question answer was done over Join Me, I think.
Oh, so they did online questions and answers. It wasn't a document.
And so, then they documented it. They documented it and then sent it out to everybody. Because what happened is they had limited it to, I think, 50 attendees. And I was one of the attendees on the call, but the call filled up in like 30 seconds. And the second somebody dropped, somebody joined. So I think they looked after and they were able to see something like 200 people were trying to join and only 50 were able to be there.
Wow.
So they had the question and answer session. They put them in a document and they sent it out. There were hundreds of questions.
Wow. Yeah. So, that's interesting to respond to a part of the RFP. And, I guess that makes sense if you are, you're teaming up with another company. But typically you wouldn't just reply to a part of an RFP if you were just doing it on your own, right?
Yeah, I that's definitely true. And I mean, it depends on the size of the project. So like for this particular one, and I think it's a good example because it was so large. I think if I remember correctly, there were actually 4 parts to it. One was development, which was the part that, I was assisting with. There was hosting, which was completely separate. It had, since it was such a large government website, it had a lot of red tape. So it was, it had to be somewhere specific. There was a training session, but like a large chunk of training for all the like 400 users or something, I think, across the different departments. And then ongoing maintenance was, I think, the 4th part. So each part was taken by different companies, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, it's it's amazing to me because, the size of an RFP response like that is it's huge. And, our next question is like, what's the effort? The question is actually how many do you respond to? But I can tell you very honestly, I do not know. I know in the last month I've responded to 2. But, I would say that, maybe it's 1 to 2 a month, maybe. But the effort in responding, it can be, on a really big scale, as you just said, with the state of Massachusetts, that RFP took multiple companies, probably weeks, if not months, to like craft a response. And, I think a lot of times it comes down to the level of effort, the likeliness that you're going to get it, and, what the bottom line is, what kind of budget it is going to be assigned to the project, right? So, the other aspect there too that you have to think about is, especially with municipal, state, and government RFPs, there are companies out there that are going to lowball them.
Yeah.
We replied to an RFP a couple months ago, and because it was, local government, the RFPs were all unsealed. They were public record. And we saw some of the other agencies' dollar amounts, and we just could not figure out how they could do it for that price. And, that you got to factor that in too. You have to think about, okay, well, if I go in at this price, I feel pretty good about that, but am I going to be able to get the job done? Like at the end, is there going to be, is it going to be a good feeling, or is it going to be like, it didn't work out? So
and
there's a lot that goes into it.
When you're looking at municipality and government RFPs too, there's another layer, and that is generally, especially for certain dollar amounts, like I think local government in Massachusetts, if it's over $5,000, they have to go to RFP. They have to get at least 3 bids, and they're required by law to choose the lowest bid, unless there's some factor that they can point to that says, like, so for example, if somebody comes in and says, I bid $1, they don't have to choose that if the person doesn't know how to program, right? So if they can point to some service that somebody's providing, or say, for example, the project requires translation, one company bid 5,000, but they don't have a translator. The other bid 10,000, but they have a translator, right? They could use the $10,000 person and say, well, it's because they have the expertise of having the translator. But in general, when you're competing against other companies, it's not just you have to be in the middle of the pack. Whereas in a company, you don't usually want to be the cheapest person. You don't want to be the most expensive person, generally. Being somewhere in the middle, as long as putting you in the running.
Yep.
The government, many times that's not the case. If you're in the middle, you're cut. Now, I think there is a problem with RFPs too, other than the lack of information sometimes that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. And that is, many times when people write an RFP, they have somebody in mind for the RFP.
Sure. And
they're writing it for that person. They're putting it out because they're required to, but they're doing everything. They're going to give it to that other, whoever they've selected beforehand. I'm just curious, for our listeners, how do you determine, do you do any thought about that before you even start replying to an RFP? Do you look at it and try to determine if it's tailored for somebody before you respond?
That's a great question. So no, I think if you're looking at an RFP and it's in an industry that you're not familiar with, or it's, got a lot of technology that you're not familiar with, you can very easily say like, this isn't really for us. Right. as I said previously, people that are writing RFPs are usually doing a little bit of pre-work and going to companies and saying like, hey, if you had to build this, like how might you go about it, or how might you do this to kind of get that information. So, typically in those instances, I think, let's see, about 2 or 3 months ago, I had a phone call with somebody. It was very much that type of phone call where he was like, hey, we're putting together an RFP. It's going to be a Drupal site. We need to do this. We need to do that. We're working with this hosting partner. Like, what questions would you have for us if you were to, if you were to reply to this? And, we had a great conversation, and he wasn't overly forthcoming with some of the questions that I asked. He was like, well, that'll be in the RFP, which is fine. But it created the dialogue, and it also gave him a basis for his RFP. So, I'm assuming that he did that with not just us, but a couple of other companies. Based on that, you can kind of push all of those results together into a great into an RFP that a lot of different companies will want to reply to.
Yep.
As far as RFPs that are specific towards one company, like, hey, we're just putting this RFP together as a formality. We have, I won't say we've never seen that, but, you can typically read through it and go, okay, well, we have this, and this, so that's a good fit. Or we don't have this, we have this, but we don't have this. It's not really a good fit. So,
yeah.
It's really, as I said at the beginning of the show, my personal feeling is it's not the best way to, to start a project. It's not the best way to build a relationship. At Oomph, where one of our core values is being personal, and, the RFP is like not the most personal approach that you could take. Yeah. We'd much rather have a conversation and, figure out what the right solution is, as opposed to like just checking boxes. But, it's the way, it's the way cities and towns do business. It's the way, yep. A lot of companies do business. So it's just kind of a fact of life.
Yeah, I think it does provide, there is value in RFPs, like in themselves. I think that value is, especially on the government side, is it provides that transparency. Without RFPs, contracts would be far more corrupt. They would just go to people that people in the government knew. You know what I mean? Right. Whereas an RFP, people know that projects exist. People can bid on them. People can see whether or not somebody's getting, like, people in the industry, say, I don't know how much it costs to, pave a road or replace a sidewalk, right? But if a municipality puts out a bid to replace their sidewalk, and somebody is, they handle, hardscaping, and they see that the person paid twice as much as what they should, well, then they can raise that information and be like, hey, why are we paying, $10 a square foot when the most premium person charges $5 a square foot, right? On the website side, I might say, a good example might be, hey, this single page HTML page for this government landing page, this company charged $50,000 to get that static HTML site up. That's just one page. Why are they paying $50,000 for that? That's like 6 hours of work.
Yeah. I guess I agree with everything you're saying. I guess I would much rather, instead of like an RFP where it's like, here's a document with all of what we think our requirements are, I'd rather it be like, hey, you have to open up a request for presentation, and you have to accept, 20 people to present, and, have it be more conversational than like, here's a Word document. Okay, here are all my questions. Okay, here's another Word document with your answers. Okay, put it in, and like hopefully maybe it's checks all the boxes, and somebody else hasn't underbid this thing incredibly.
I guess it's not
the RFP itself. It's more the process that I have a problem with.
I think also that dialogue is what tells you if it's going to be a good fit, because the good fit isn't just what is the project and what's the price. Good fit is, how do they expect milestones to be hit? How do they expect communication? How do they, on both sides, how do you get sign off on a feature? I mean, and that kind of stuff is much easier to elicit in a conversation or a presentation.
I mean, every project is building a relationship, and it's really hard to build a relationship through paper, right? It's really hard to get a feel for somebody through a document.
Absolutely. So questions are almost always part of an RFP. Question, you mentioned a couple of times just emailing back and forth the document. I mentioned having, a group meeting before. There's also just kind of one-on-one meetings. What do you see as most common with RFPs?
Most common is submit your questions and we will answer them. And typically the way that works is they'll put an email address into the RFP. It says, send your questions here. And what they'll do is they'll compile all of the questions into a document and then email that out to everybody that emailed to them with questions. So
makes sense.
That's typical. There have been some instances where, we have been able to get on phone calls with folks. That's more in the corporate space, I would say, where they're doing kind of a little bit of pre-work to try to figure out what they need to put into their RFP. And those conversations are usually great because you can get a little bit of insight as to what they're looking for. And then you can also help them kind of, think about a couple of things that they may not have already been thinking about. But I would say that those are, that's not the norm, definitely not the norm. And then I did actually reply to an RFP a couple of months ago that did all three of those things. Basically, they had a meeting before they put the RFP out. Then they requested questions by email. And then they set up a phone call and answered everybody's questions, and then allowed people to ask more questions. So that was experience was not typical, but it did make you feel very connected to the individuals.
So I think on one of my last questions on the replying side, I think one of my is, do you have any tips for making yourself stand out? Like, how do you? If everybody's just replying to the same document, same set of requirements, how do you make yourself stand out against a field of who knows how many people are responding?
I think you have to look at a couple of things, right? So I think you got to look at how the RFP is being delivered. And that seems kind of silly because you're like, well, how is it going to be delivered? But a lot of RFPs are, especially if they're for municipalities, are basically print out hard copies, or it's some combination of hard copies and digital copies. So you want to make sure that your RFP looks good in a printed format, right? If it's going to be a fully digital delivery, then make sure it looks good in a digital format. Because that's the first thing that's going to stand out to them when they're reading through it. Like, oh, this is it's easy to read. It's nice. Using layman's terms, obviously, like don't overly over-technify your RFP, because a lot of times you don't know who's reading it. It could be an overly technical person. It could not be an overly technical person. And then, as far as being able to stand out, if you are able to get in front of the person sending out the RFP and ask questions, make sure you're asking questions. Make sure you're asking really good questions. I'll go back to that RFP phone call I was talking about a few minutes ago. And I remember one of the last questions, this lady just said, just out of curiosity. And in hindsight, I was really mad that I didn't ask this question because everybody on the call was thinking it. But she said, just out of curiosity, instead of replying to this RFP as a fixed bid, kind of checking all the boxes that you guys have put in here, could we just reply to this RFP with a budget for discovery and do a discovery and then a budget for what we think it might cost after the fact? Everybody on the call was kind of like, oh, she just asked that. And everybody was kind of like, oh, why didn't I ask that? And it really stood out. And what ended up happening is the individuals that were putting out the RFP said, you know what, we don't know. We'll get back to you on Monday. and they emailed the group on Monday and said, yeah, you know what, we'll allow for a separate budget for discovery, and then what you think the budget is going to be for a finished product, but we have to have both budgets because we have to
Yep.
we have to budget for it, find the money for it, so on and so forth. So I think those three things, or two things, can really make you stand out if you're well prepared.
Okay, so I think the last thing is, have you ever written an RFP? We've talked a lot about responding to RFPs, but have you ever written one or put one out?
I have not put one out myself, but I have helped organizations put requirements into an RFP. But I've never actually put out an RFP myself. No.
So the reason why I thought of this is I actually worked with a customer over the last 2 weeks to put together an RFP and put it out. It's non-Drupal. So it wasn't something that I was, it was for a project that I wasn't particularly interested in building myself, but the client wanted me to oversee it. So I actually was put in charge of writing the RFP. I put it out and had some responses. And so while I was putting it together, I was trying to think like all the little things that, I've seen in RFPs that annoyed me, and if I could solve them. And the two main ones that came up for me were the being too vague on the project requirements and being too anonymous for discussions about the requirements or asking questions, right? And by anonymous, I mean just like having that somebody send in an email with some questions and then sending out a blast saying, here were all the questions and here are the answers we got. Do you want X? Yes. Do you want Y? No.
I mean, I don't understand how that's typically how it goes. What did they find issue with? The fact that you basically didn't reply to them individually and say, well, so-and-so, here are the answers to your question.
What I'm saying is, when I was writing the RFP, I was trying to think of things that as a responder I would like. And so one of the things that I did is, unfortunately, because of the project itself, we couldn't be super detailed about what we were doing. So I couldn't check that box. So it was significantly more vague than I wanted it to be.
Sure.
But one of the things that I did that I think has helped us a lot, there were two things. One, instead of just saying you have to send us questions by email or do this or do that, I blocked off a set of time for a specific day. And then I just blocked off 30-minute conversations with everybody so that I could discuss with them what the project was, whether they were a good fit. And then I was able to have who they thought would be the lead developer on the call, who they thought would be the PM on the call. And then, there was another piece of, unique piece of technology. So they would have that, that developer on the call as well. And so then we could discuss the process, discuss any questions that they had, any details. And because I'm a developer myself, any of the things, there were many things that they say, well, you say that you want this, but we don't have the details. And I could tell them, as a developer, like that's a very difficult thing. You should be concerned about it, plan for it. Or I could say, we don't have a lot of detail there, but it's a very straightforward task with what we have. And so we were able, I think that gave us a lot of, that helped us out. We actually sought out 5 companies specifically. And, just from those discussions alone, we found out 2 of them wouldn't be a good fit. Because one of them wasn't in the right space, and one of them was their budget idea was significantly out of the range of my client. And so we were able to narrow down from 5 to 3 right there. And then we got fairly competitive bids. It just came in 2 days ago. So I haven't had a chance to fully review them all, but it's been an interesting process kind of handling it from the other side, so to speak.
Yeah, I can imagine that being pretty interesting. I don't know. I don't know if I would ever go down the RFP road if I didn't absolutely have to. So that's
well, yeah, this was one of those things where the client needed a specific, expertise in a specific technology that I don't have expertise in is extremely hard to hire into. So we needed to find a company that has that expertise.
Right.
And so an RFP, the company's been trying to hire somebody in that field for 8 months and hasn't been successful. So we had this project. This project's been delayed already, like I said, 8 months.
Right.
So we kind of had to go that way.
Interesting. So how did you distribute the RFP?
So it was kind of a two-part process. So the three people in charge, including myself, of kind of the RFP process, we first came up with a list of potential companies that we thought would be a good fit based on, we've worked with them in the past or their stated, competencies, and just a couple of recommendations. We reached out to them by email to say, hey, we're putting together an RFP related to XYZ technology and products. Would you be interested in responding? Most of them said yes. A couple of them said no right off the bat. So then we put together the RFP and emailed it to them. And I think we scheduled a call about a week after the RFP went out. And I think 4 of them followed up on the calls. And then, like I said, 3 of them have responded. So it was an interesting process to see. Like, it's funny because, when you get an RFP, you're always looking at it like, oh, wow, there's so much missing here. But then as somebody generating an RFP, you're like, wow, this doesn't have any information, but we can't really put all the details in there because there's concerns about putting all the details of your business logic into the public. Essentially, right. Where people that don't have a, relationship with you can access, as well as the amount of time, it would have taken me 25 hours to get all the detail in that we needed. Right. And, since we were having, since I was having that point discussion, and this is the project I've worked on for over a year at this point, so I have really intimate knowledge of it, we could answer a lot of those questions. Many times when you're in an RFP answer session, it's with somebody who doesn't have the technical side, technical expertise. Many times it's just, one of the stakeholders, or maybe it's a few rungs down from the stakeholders. So many times when you ask a question, the answer is, oh, I have to check, I'll get back to you.
Right.
Whereas in this case, the CEO and myself were on the call. So if they had a business question like, hey, is this that critical, the CEO could say yes or no. And if they had a technical question on difficulty, I could say, this is very difficult, this is very easy, or, this should be, a junior dev could take care of this in half a day or something. So they were able to, I think they were able to get really fine point. And then the other piece of it actually for this RFP actually is we're looking for an agency to make that relationship with. So it's not like, it's not like this project needs to be, okay, you tell us the cheapest possible and then we'll never talk to you again. We're looking for somebody who they take care of this particular problem, but then they maintain it and add additional features in the future. So,
right.
If there's a little bit of uncertainty there, we don't care so much. Like we really just want to know, okay, this is your rate. This is how, this is how you work. And then we can get this one project out and then you can fix the whole backlog of stuff that we've got.
Right.
Moving forward. And so, yeah, it was definitely an interesting project, something I've never done before. And, I now appreciate RFPs a little bit more because the truth is, if you need to hire somebody in a field that you don't have expertise in, how do you invite those experts to come give you their opinion on the project, right?
It's true. So maybe everybody should write an RFP at one point or another, just to understand where those people are coming from. On that note, if any of our listeners have questions, they can write us an RFP. No, just kidding. If you have questions or feedback, reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal or in the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel, or you can email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can get show updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you to our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can always learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. Patrons get access to our raw feed, which includes a little bit before and after the show. And as always, John, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
You can reach me on all the social media and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, or you can check out the new oomfink.com at oomfink.com.
And you can reach me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, Nicxvan. And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Have a good one.
See you next week.